12:11. And we'll start with introductions.
George Martinez.
Karen Bronga.
Kevin Cross.
Felix Rivera.
Scott Myers.
Anna Brawley.
Meg Zalatel. And on the phone, Chris Constant.
Yep, here.
And Randy Solt.
I'm here, and I'll apologize. I have to hop off when the plane door shuts.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Solt. We've got Mr. Johnson and here at the table with us.
Glenn Cipriano, Treasurer.
And Al Tamani, Budget Advisory Commission.
Great. So we will hop right in. We've got a full agenda as always. So Mr. Tamanji, if you want to go ahead and give us the update of the Budget Advisory Commission, make sure the light turns green.
I'm Al Tamani. I'm here on behalf of Hull and Claudia from the Budget Advisory Commission.
Okay. Do you want to give an update to us about what the commission's been up to?
Well, we've had a lot of new members on here the last couple of 3 months, and so we've had a chance to orientate them into our general process, and it's going to work pretty well. We have a very well-balanced skill board, and we've elected to take a look at each department as a whole. In other words, the whole board will sit down with, say, the fire department or the police department or the assembly and take a look at their budgets. And it's been very informative. The people have been very attentive, and I think we're going to be off to a very good run this year and be able to provide you some real good information. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. It's exciting that you have a full slate of folks now, and we appreciate you looking into those departmental budgets. I'm sure it's already on your radar, but we will be taking up budget amendments on November 9th from members.
Okay.
Any questions to the Budget Advisory Commission? All right. Well, we very much appreciate you being here, and we look forward to any recommendations the commission may have for this budget. We'll go ahead and turn to our next item, which is an update from the MOA Trust Fund Board. It says CFO. Is there an update? If there isn't one, we can just.
I do. I have that update.
Okay,
Madam Chair.
great. Thank you, Mr. Cipriano.
Okay, so the MOA Trust Fund Board had its initial organizational meeting on October 3rd. Can I turn it off for you, Alex? There you go. On October 3rd, and elected to 2-year terms were Alex Slivka as chair, Jeff Sins as vice chair, and Alex and Jeff are both former CFOs for the municipality. Julie Farley was elected as secretary, and Ross Risvold will be treasurer. At their first regular meeting on October 16th, RVK conducted an investment review of the current portfolio for the board. The chair introduced first drafts of most of their major policies, including their investment policy, for discussion, and the board also addressed web content for public reporting purposes. So with that first public meeting, according to code, the formal fiduciary status has been passed from the board, passed to the board from the treasurer, and the Investment Advisory Commission has ceased to exist. So all meetings will be held in the Treasury Conference Room on the 3rd floor. The next meeting is scheduled for December 14th. And that's your update.
Great. Thank you. We will do updates on the trust fund board as we believe that they are needed. So if you just give us a heads up if there's been some action taken by the board or some update is needed, we'll make sure to add it to the agenda. Any questions? All right. Well done getting that board in place and getting that first meeting underway. I know that was a big push. Thank you. Next, we have an update on ARPA grant distribution funding update. Says Mr. Byrd, Chief of Staff. I don't see him. So I think we'll do is we'll move on. And if he joins us later, we can circle back unless we have someone coming to the rescue. No. Okay. So let's move on to update on FEMA reimbursement.
This is Ross Risvold again, and I do not happen to have an update for FEMA reimbursement. That's the That's an Alden thing, and he does a great job of it, and he'll be back on Monday. And if there's any need prior to the next meeting, we can send him an email, and he can provide an update as needed.
Great. And that seems perfectly reasonable, especially being in the middle of the budget season. All right. I think I just saw Ms. Bonzoff walk in right on cue. Would you like to come join us, please? We're going to move to the update on budget, review the monthly budget to actuals report, as well as the alcohol tax budget to actuals report, and then have a conversation about the CPI calculation.
Thank you. Hi, this is Marilyn Bonzoff. I do apologize. I do not have the information readily available at this time.
Okay. So could we get the monthly budget to actuals and the alcohol tax budget to actuals report sometime between now and when we're preparing our assembly budget amendments on the 9th? It's just nice to have that context of kind of how we're spent on the current budget.
Absolutely. Yeah, the goal is by COB today.
Okay, great. And if you just send those to Desiree, she'll get them out to all members.
Will do, and I apologize. And that will be through September.
Okay, so we will look for those budget to actuals through the beginning or end of September.
End of September.
End of
posted
September.
through
Okay,
today.
so all the way through third quarter.
Yes,
Okay, great.
thank you. I apologize.
That's okay. Any questions? Yes, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, not a question, just a comment. It's related to alcohol tax. I believe OMB and the library were working together to get funding out the door. There was money for Best Beginnings, a direct grant, and then funding for a fundraising position that goes to, I believe, the Library Foundation or Friends of the Library. So I know those have been a long time in the works, so I appreciate that we saw those on our agenda already, and I believe they were passed on Tuesday. So again, thank you, because that was something that we'd heard about for several months. So I'm glad that it got resolved. Thanks.
Great. Any other questions before we turn to CPI calculation? All right. So what we were hoping to do here is get a little bit of primer on the CPI calculation because it's such a factor in the budget, and it's also not necessarily the simplest thing to know. So could you please walk us through this year's CPI calculation?
Absolutely. And I did not bring visuals. My computer so what I can say is for the CPI calculation, for the tax cap calculation, is this computer available for use? Is that something you'd like to see? I can walk you through it verbally. So I believe it's definitely codified, possibly in the charter, where we use the 5-year average for CPI to determine an adjustment to the tax cap base. We do get the CPI data by year from the state and federal entities. And then take it to a 5-year average. Let me see if I can get.
And we've asked to see if Ms. Camacho can pull up the 120-day memo at least, which will show us what we do see.
Okay. So if the focus is on just the, let's see here. No visuals is not ideal.
It's okay. We've got plenty of time since we didn't have one of our other reports, so you can just take a beat and get what you need.
2 of mine, and that's all. Okay, So Desiree's bringing up the tax cap for us. And as you can see, it is row 14. Nope, I apologize. Row 21 shows the change in the consumer price index. For 2024 proposed, we had a 2.8%. And it is built with the actual CPI that we get from the Department of Labor, the State Department of Labor. And what I do is I also verify with a federal, I think it's also, actually, I apologize. I think the federal is Department of Labor and the state is community. I don't recall the sources, and I'm sorry, my computer is blank. I verify the CPI for each year, and it's typically available after January, and I verify it from 2 entities. For the 120-day memo, and also for the proposed budget, the CPI for the prior year isn't yet available, and because it typically comes out in January for the prior year. And so for the CPI 5-year average, we'll still have the previous 4 years from the full year sources. And then what we used for 2023 CPI in the 2024 proposed budget and 120-day memo is the state's identified mid-year CPI. And that is the number that we've been historically using for the 120-day memo and the proposed budget. I've had conversations with the state in the past, as to what do you think would be the best thing to do at this time? I tell them what the purpose is for me to use the CPI, and, it could go up, could go down. And we just landed that, the half-year number is published, it's been identified, and we've been consistently using it for probably the last handful of budget iterations. I think I feel confident that we've pretty much used it ever since I had that conversation with the state.
Okay, great. That's helpful. That raises a couple of questions that I have. I'll kick off and then we'll, if that's okay. So when we use a mid-year CPI and then when we learn the new number in January, my understanding is any difference is made up at the first quarter budget revisions, that we true up what the actual number was and if it should shift the calculation at first quarter in the following year.
Absolutely. The tax cap is the full, the cap is adjusted. Absolutely.
My understanding, and I may be wrong in this, and this is partly why I wanted to have this conversation, is if we find that the CPI adjustment creates more room, more taxing room under the cap, that typically anything we add to the budget after the first of the year in that first quarter budget revision is considered a one-time expenditure, yet the room under the cap is recurring for all intents and purposes because it's space up to the cap and it's not going to just simply disappear unless there's a dramatic change with CPI in that budget year. And so I'm just trying to reconcile kind of how we handle recurring budgeting items and one-time budget items, because having that space in the recurring budget makes a lot more sense if it was available versus using it up with one-time expenditures. And that was a little bit of the part of the conversation I wanted to have today, because I expect that we'll see some space in the new year. And a lot of the other ways where we don't necessarily have a firm number, we do projections, but here is one of those times we don't. And so I find that we have different approaches that lend to a little bit of different approach for purposes of budgeting style, one time versus recurring. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. Thank you. The tax cap, the calculation of the cap inclusive of the adjustments for full year population CPI. When we adjust the cap in first quarter versus proposed, we will adjust the entire cap, not only the CPI and population changes. We'll adjust the new construction with the updated new assessed values for construction. Any additional unknown judgments, updated debt service, and also updated non-property taxes to be reduced from the total tax base to get down to what we can collect for taxes. The tax amount, and this is for the 5 majors, is typically considered an ongoing revenue source, with the exception of the settlements, right? And those usually, when we budget settlements that are being recovered in the tax cap, those are typically considered one-time items because the cap is increased once, budget's increased once to recover it, and then next year it goes out. So during first quarter, another aspect of first quarter is also adjusting the fund balance reserve. And so with the fund balance, so we just established the tax capacity is typically considered ongoing with a couple of exceptions, but then the fund balance is typically not. And so with the fund balance, if it is determined that the reserves are met and that there may be additional fund balance above our fund balance reserves, then that may be used for as part of to fund budgeted items within that fiscal year. And typically those budget items should be considered one time because that funding source is one time. In practice, there are also policy calls that can be made. Sometimes there are policy calls that other budget items may be determined to be one time using ongoing revenue sources. And sometimes a policy call may be made that one-time sources, funding sources are used for ongoing items, and then the adjustments will have to be used later on. Typically, we do identify one-time items in the budget, and then hopefully it's offset with or funded with one-time funding sources. Best practice is to use ongoing funding sources for ongoing spending and one-time funding sources for one-time spending.
Thank you. Actually, that was fantastic because what I think I have is a full understanding, which is at first quarter, we need to maybe be more clear about what we're doing, whereas we're doing one times because it is potentially fund balance. And we need to be saying these are one-time expenditures versus this is the additional room due to the adjustment in the tax cap. And so we intend for these to be recurring expenses. So we don't see those maybe automatically backed out of the budget in the next budget cycle. Is that fair?
I believe I followed yes. And
Okay.
typically based on what is written in the amendments. So if the assembly, so if the mayor proposes and identifies one-time items, we do identify those in the budget documents. And then if the assembly does do amendments, typically on the amendment documents, there is a funding source and then also an identifier whether or not those amendments are intended to be ongoing or recurring. And then if they are approved, we identify those in the budget as they were identified on the amendments.
Great. Yes, I think this can help improve our process for first quarter because I don't know that we're always identifying the difference between fund balance and recalculated tax cap capacity. So it's just something for us to flag. And I find this very helpful. Any other questions about this? Yes, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, I have one. So I know this is one of the mechanisms in the budget that is not purely discretionary, right? So it's part of the tax cap formula. I believe it's in the charter, at least the general point that it needs to be, it needs to utilize CPI, that 5-year average. I guess my question is, this goes back a ways. It's been in our code for a while. What is the general intent of this policy? Is there a sense of that? Is it just to account for inflation over time, or maybe this is something I need to go back to the original 1980s intent?
The policy of the 5-year average or?
Just the policy of having, having this controlled increase in our, well, in theory, increase, it could be a decrease, but change in our tax capacity year over year.
I believe it's, if you'd like, I believe it's just meant to show growth in the economy. And so the taxing, if you have a spend, your supplies and stuff cost increase, so then your tax cap can increase. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I think just to clarify too, so it can go down, right? So I know it's unusual to have inflation, a negative inflation, but we did have that in a prior year. So it's not necessarily always going up, is that right? I mean, just the way that it's written.
The CPI may not go up, but the base of the cap is the prior year's amount to be collected. So it may go down based on that calculation. Yeah.
Mr. Bowman, would you like to weigh in?
Thank you.
Hi. Just to offer a little additional insight, Ben Bowman, Assistant Municipal Attorney, through the chair to Assemblymember Brawley. The tax cap, as we talk about, is the formulaic structured thing. And as Marilyn was saying, one of the inputs is the prior year's taxable amount. So if the prior year's taxable amount goes down, maybe because we have a shrunk budget, then it can reduce subsequent years' caps. So that, I think that gets to what you were asking.
Okay. Any other questions on the tax cap calculation or how it relates to CPI? Mr. Cross?
Oh, not so much as a direct question, but more of, it would be nice to see, along with our annual budget, which is those priorities that didn't make it into the budget or things that we recognize need to be funded one time, so that when we have fund balance, a positive fund balance, or we have other spendings that came in under projections, that we've identified in advance to the taxpayer where we intend to put those funds. And I guess, because there's plenty of we have plenty of deficiencies, I would say, in areas of our government that have been languishing for years. But if we were to put those and say, hey, should we run into a fund balance, or should we just know that we've already targeted these areas in advance for those monies, and what we're doing with it. So it doesn't look like, ooh, look, we've got this extra money, we just want to go, the perception from the public is whenever you give us a dime, we're going to spend a quarter. And so, like, if we were to set that out in advance, I guess that would kind of be, for my household budget, I know things that I have a monthly budget. And then if there's excess, like, here's some things that I need to fix around the house. I guess it'd be nice to say to the taxpayer, we've identified these needs. And when we have fund balances or we have extra funds we've identified, we wanted you to know it's our intention to put that money there. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. And I think as you talk to departments, you'll find that some departments have kind of that tick list or checklist. I had one more question on CPI calculation. Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, thank you. Just to kind of circle to Mr. Bowman's comment there, just to make sure I'm following this correctly. So if we do reduce the budget for a year, say because we expect to spend less money, need less money, whatever, and we bring it down by a set amount, that establishes the baseline for the following year. And we can only go up from there according to what the population, the CPI, allows us to do. Correct? So just something that I'm trying to keep in mind here, because let's say we see an opportunity to significantly reduce the budget because we think there's perhaps transient circumstances that allow us to spend less money, but going forward, that will potentially dig a hole for us in future years. Am I understanding this correctly? We can go down as much as we want, but we can only go up by what sort of the population CPI adjustments allow, right?
In general, yes. Yeah, your amount that you can increase from the prior year is limited. You can go down a total amount, but you can only make incremental increases year over year.
Thank you. I myself in the queue and then Ms. Brawley. So I saw in the CPI tables, I believe it's the Department of Labor Workforce Development, showed the half-year CPI for 2023 at 2%, but the 120-day memo has it at 0.6%. And that seems to be a bit of a discrepancy. So if you want to maybe look into that and get back to me, that would be great. Or if you're ready to address it, I don't know if your computer's giving you a hard time. So, and I think that's partly what drove a little bit of this conversation was seeing what was in the 120-day memo and then what was actually on the State Department of Labor's website. So, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. This is just a request for follow-up information, and I'll preface it with, the CPI calculation is an average, as I understand it, and it looks at a number of different categories. I would be interested in understanding the cost escalation for the muni over maybe say the last 5 years on healthcare costs, because I know we're self-insured, and obviously there's other factors in that calculation. But what I'm getting at is that when you look at an average, it doesn't account for the fact that many cost categories, including housing, which affects all of us really, but affects our workers to the extent that we have renters in our workforce, which I think is true. And then also, as I said, healthcare. Our health insurance costs have continued to go up. Our direct costs for healthcare have gone up. I know that the Muni has taken great steps with things like the Vera Clinic that kind of encourage people to use primary care and prevention, which is less expensive. But I just wanted to flag the fact that essentially by using this average, it doesn't necessarily account for some of the real cost escalations or inflation that we see in categories that directly influence the municipality. I'll also point out gas. We talked about fleet costs, that going up. In any vehicles on the road, we're all paying higher. So again, recognizing that this is not something that we can just change, right? But that there are, to my mind, some flaws in it. And so I would just want to understand, as I said, that kind of broad average and then how it actually stacks up with the costs that we see in our own municipal operations.
If I may, the CPI that is used for the tax cap is the CPIU, the urban CPI. It's the urban CPI for the Anchorage area. Are you asking for the CPI med and the breakdown of the CPI over the last 5 years? Or I apologize, may I ask for clarification on what you're asking for?
Yeah, I guess I would be and maybe this is something HR could provide, just kind of the last 5 years, the estimated cost increase for providing health insurance to all of our employees. So I know that's one of the categories in the CPI itself and generally is across the market, but I just want to compare if that is, say, 3% average, and then our healthcare costs have been going up 6%. I mean, those are just hypothetical numbers, but just showing those two, I would be interested. And so maybe it is looking at the CPI generally, and then the medical cost, because you mentioned it does have categories, and then also looking at, as I said, our actual cost increases year over year for the last, say, 5 years. We don't have to go back that far.
Great. Any other questions on CPI and the tax cap calculation? It takes years to figure out the tax cap calculation unless it just clicks. For a few, it does. All right. Well, then, thank you, Marilyn, very much. Good luck with your computer. You have my sympathies with technology. So we'll go over the MOA financial status next, including the monthly revenue report from Treasury and FY24 budget, any updated revenue projections. Thanks.
Ms. Zalatel, if I may, I can express what Alden would say today. I spoke to the controller earlier today, and he does believe that, in fact, we will close the year of 2022, December, today, in fact. He hopes to do that today. And as we do that, he is finishing up the footnotes that are usually come towards the end and addressing any input he's received from our BDO external auditors. And we hope to have audited financial statements prior to the end of this year. So that is the update on the financial statements.
There we go. Madam Chair, we've supplied revenue summary highlights as of 10/22. Excuse me, you have the brief report in front of you. We're just looking at the dashboard initially. Total 2023 budget revenues we're working off of is 807.5 million. To date, posted in an SAP, we're at 733 million approximately. So that's about 91% year-to-date realization. And I'm just going to highlight, if I could, briefly, just a couple of areas where we are seeing significant deviance from 2023 budget. I'll start on page 2. If you could take a look at the private payment in lieu of taxes, this is a calculation done internally by Chugach and Aurora Base Housing. And based on a difference in plant utilization for Chugach, looks like we'll be down about 1.46 million from the budgeted amount, which is a significant deviation. And then I'd comment briefly on real property and personal property tax. Even though real property is down about $1.5 million, when you total the two, it looks like we'll be above budget by about $2.5 million. So positive $2.5 million if you combine real property and personal property tax. If you look right below that at cash pool earnings, this is always a very difficult category for the for Treasury to get its hands around. It's very dependent on where interest rates are when you're doing your report. As you know, GASB requires us to report our cash pool as if we sold every security that day. So originally 7.4 was the original budget. And based on the persistent high interest rates, we're expecting a negative variance of about 550,000. Looks like we'll come in right around 7 million for cash pool earnings. And then if you'll look on page 3, room tax, we don't have anything in SAP right now. So what we did was go to Harris Govern system, which you may or may not know that the hotels report directly into. They give us their quarterly fees. And right now, as of 10/22, Harris Govern is at approximately 31 million in revenues. Okay, for the year. Again, let's call that mid-October. So they had been running about 10% above 2022 numbers. So we are confident that we'll see at least 10% over 2022's actual of 40 million, which was a record. So our range is from 44 to 46 million for room taxes this year. Okay. Let me see what else I had. And finally, I'd highlight auto registration, which is on page 4. We're down about almost 500,000 from 2022. The reasons could be the persistent high interest rates. And in 2022, there was a lot of late postings in January. So if we look at the overall budget and we plug in our numbers for hotels and our hotel room tax, and we plug in 7 million for the cash pool, it takes us within 2 to 2.5% of the annual budget revenues of 807 million. So that's the number we'll peg, about 2 to 2.5% variance from that number, either positive or negative. That's our report. Happy to take any questions.
First up, Ms. Brawley.
Thank you. As I look at this, I'll just note, I'm trying to reconcile the statements you made and kind of some of the optimism of these revenue projections with what's in our budget. And I understand these are two different departments working on it, but just to flag that. And I know that's something that we can come back to at first quarter. My question is around real property tax. So I see there's a variance of negative 1.5 million. So pretty close, but under. I just wonder if you could characterize. Is that really the new personal property, or sorry, not personal, the residential property exemption that went into place, that increase?
Yes. And then again, we use the CAMA system, and this is our second year. We're on our own this year. We had assistance last year. So I think most of that 1.5 is basically us working through the system.
And then I see there's a note too, because it says that's under, but then it says if you add real and personal property
Right.
tax, that it would actually, the overall would exceed, but the property tax
It
is
did.
down.
Correct.
And then one additional question. I think this is actually something to dig into more with the assessor, but I just want to ask it now. what kind of review or regular, I guess, enforcement of the residential property tax exemption is there? Because, and I mentioned that because you have to be living in your house to get it. And I know that you can apply for it once. And then in theory, you would hope somebody, if they move out of state and keep that property, whatever it is, would do the right thing and let the city know. But I don't think that always happens. So I just wondered what kind of follow-up there is to make sure that people are complying with that.
Yeah, I cannot speak to that. I think that would probably be more appropriately addressed to the assessor's office.
Thank you.
I had a question on the ambulance fees, SEMT reimbursement revenues. I know this is reported as combined, but when we look at our budgeting documents, as we're working on the budget, they are actually separated out as two separate line items. Is there any way to kind of get where we're at in each of those categories?
Yes, there is. These are combined for this reporting purposes, but I can get that breakout for you. I recall 3.5 to 4 million outside of the SEMT, but I'll double check and get that number for you.
Thank you. And then on the municipal assistance line, I know we were waiting on the closeout of 2022. And is that for the payment expected from 2022 or 2023 for community or municipal assistance?
I believe it's for 2022.
Okay,
I'll
so
double
we're
check that as
awaiting a
well.
2022 payment. And do we know if we received a 2023 payment?
I will have to check into that.
Okay, thank you. All right, I don't see any other questions on the monthly revenue report and the FY24 updated revenue projections. I think the question really is, are we expected to see any, or should we be planning to see any for purposes of the budget as we kind of move closer to finalizing the budget for 2024?
Your question was again, I'm sorry.
Are we expecting to see the administration, and maybe you can't answer this, put forward any updated revenue projections for purposes of the 2024 budget?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? All right. Well, that concludes our new business. Legislative priorities for state legislative program. I don't believe we have any for this committee right now. Budget items for 2024, we're all in. Everyone's working on the budget, so we'll take those up separately between the work sessions and the amendments. Would anyone here like to participate through audience participation? All right. Well, with that, we will adjourn.